Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a world that you might think you know, but probably don't. You've heard the sensational stories of Aztec sacrifice, of blood flowing down the temple steps, of priests in feathered headdresses raising obsidian blades. But what you don't hear as often is the story of what it meant to live the kind of life that ended there. The routines, the farming, the endless lists of obligations that filled a day in Tenochtitlan. That's where our story begins tonight. It's a world so detailed and so demanding that, to be honest, you probably won't survive this walkthrough either. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like adding to the ritual, post your location and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world people are tuning in from, and it makes our shared history just a little more grounded. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is the mid-15th century in the Valley of Mexico. Around you stretches the vast city of Tenochtitlan, built on a cluster of islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The city doesn't appear from nowhere. It grows from canals, causeways, and markets, all alive with noise that never really stops. The first thing to know is this: the Aztecs did not think of sacrifice as a special or exotic event. For them, it was a duty woven into the very structure of the cosmos. If the sun rose each morning, it was because the gods were fed. If the rains fell in the right season, it was because the right offerings had been made. And yet, for all that grand belief, the people who lived under it still had to wake up early, tend their chinampas, those rectangular floating gardens anchored by reeds, and figure out how to pay their taxes. You might imagine the smell of wet earth in the morning, the sound of reed mats being rolled up, and the smoke from cooking fires rising over the lake. Daily life was steady, rhythmic, and, in many ways, dull. Maize had to be ground by hand into masa, tortillas had to be pressed and cooked on clay griddles, and water had to be fetched or carried. The famous turquoise masks and feathered cloaks of the nobles only existed because thousands of ordinary men and women carried firewood, gathered reeds, and paid tribute in cotton or cacao beans. For those who would one day be taken to the temple, their fates were sealed, not in that moment of ritual, but in the slow grind of life that came before. Every family belonged to a kalpuli, a neighborhood or kinship group that provided land, training, and identity. It also provided obligations. Tribute was collected regularly, and it wasn't negotiable. You might have to hand over baskets of maize, textiles woven on a backstrap loom, or even labor service. Imagine the monotony of spinning cotton thread by hand, hour after hour, knowing that most of it would never clothe your family, but would go instead into warehouses of the state. Behind all of this stood the Tlatoani, the ruler, who wasn't just a political figure, but a sacred one. His responsibility was to keep the gods fed. War wasn't fought only for conquest, but to capture enemies alive so that they could be offered at the temples. This was called the Xochiaoyotl, the Flower War. From the Aztec perspective, these wars were not quite about destruction, but about harvesting bodies, just as maize was harvested in the fields. That meant that ordinary soldiers, farmers, and even adolescents being trained in the Kalmakak schools were woven into a system where sacrifice was the endpoint. And yet, most days still began with sweeping courtyards, tending to bean plants, or hauling salt from the shores of the lake. The spectacular outcome rested on endless small chores. Now picture yourself as someone who has been taken captive. Maybe you were Tlaxcalan or Huexotzinco, or from one of the many rival city-states around the valley. The first part of your journey into Tenochtitlan would not be blood at all, but logistics. You'd be marched along causeways into the city, perhaps tied, perhaps guarded, but not killed on the spot. Inside Tenochtitlan, there were entire systems to handle captives. They were housed, sometimes paraded, sometimes given food and drink. Here's a detail that feels strange. Many were treated well enough in the short term, because they had to be kept alive for the ceremony. Ordinary citizens might see them passing by, perhaps whispering about which festival they were destined for. The ceremonies themselves were tied to the calendar. The Aztec ritual year had 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days at the end. Nearly every one of those months had at least one festival that required sacrifice. That meant the pipeline of captives had to be steady, like firewood for a hearth. When you realize that, you also realize how administrative and routine the whole system was. It wasn't just drama. It was paperwork, scheduling, and supply. Imagine the slow boredom of waiting for your turn. Days stretched out in long ritual preparation. Priests might paint you, feed you, or even encourage you to sing or dance, depending on the role you were meant to play. Some captives impersonated gods, the so-called Ixiptla, and during that period they could be dressed in fine clothing, given tobacco, even allowed to walk about with attendants. But beneath it all was the knowledge of what awaited. For the majority, life before the sacrifice was not glorious. It was hunger, fatigue, and the disorientation of being in a city that was not your own. If you were a farmer from the hills, Tenochtitlan must have seemed impossibly vast. The markets alone held tens of thousands of people, selling everything from chili peppers to jade beads. The sound of water lapping against the canals mixed with the calls of vendors. And in the distance, always visible, was the Templo Mayor rising above it all, a reminder of your likely destination. What we must remember is that Tenochtitlan was not just performing these sacrifices for itself. It was projecting power. The more captives displayed, the more legitimacy the Tlatoani had. And for the common people, seeing captives paraded to the temple was reassurance that the gods would continue to bless the city with rain and maize. Even the most mundane items in daily life were linked to this system. The salt gathered from the lake was not only for food, but for ritual purification. The obsidian blades used in sacrifice had to be mined, knapped, and transported, often in great quantity, because each blade dulled quickly and was discarded after use. The feathers in a priest's costume had been gathered from distant provinces, carried by tribute bearers who trudged along dusty roads. All of this material culture depended on sacrifice to give it meaning. To you, listening tonight, it might sound extreme or even alien. But think of it this way. For the Aztecs, the universe was fragile. Every sunrise was a battle won against darkness. Every harvest was uncertain. Sacrifice wasn't just a gruesome spectacle. It was insurance, the same way you might pay taxes or maintain an engine. The difference is that the Aztec system demanded lives instead of coins. And so, for the individual destined to be offered, the days before death were filled not with heroics, but with the grind of life in a city where everything, from maize porridge in the morning to the sound of drums echoing at dusk, reminded you of your place in the cycle. We often imagine the climax, the blade, the altar, the descent down the temple steps. But to truly understand what it meant to be an Aztec sacrifice victim, you have to sit in the long hours before to feel the weight of obligation pressing down in every ordinary detail of life. It wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was the inevitable end of a system built on fields, markets, tribute lists, and ritual calendars. And as we end this first part of the journey, one question lingers. If the daily life of an entire city was built on the certainty of sacrifice, how did ordinary people truly see themselves in that cycle, as potential victims or as participants in keeping the sun alive? If you want to understand how ordinary Aztec life ticked forward, you need to picture not a clock but a calendar. Time was measured in cycles, each day infused with sacred meaning, each month tied to rituals. The year was divided into 18 months of 20 days, with those 5 extra nameless days at the end. Days thought to be unlucky, a time when people avoided traveling or making major decisions. For you, as someone living in Tenochtitlan, this calendar wasn't optional. It dictated when fields were sown, when tributes were collected, and when ceremonies required victims. Imagine waking up and knowing that today was Tlacaxipehualistli, the Flaying of Men festival. Even if you were not directly involved, the entire city bent toward the rituals of that day. Drums would sound at dawn. Families would prepare offerings. Priests would paint themselves and carry out fasts. And somewhere, captives were being prepared. This rhythm gave structure to life, but it also meant that every ordinary activity was tethered to sacrifice. Grinding maize was not just breakfast preparation, it was sustenance for a society that believed those calories would ultimately feed warriors who brought home captives. Children were drawn into this system early. By the age of 15, boys were enrolled in schools. Some went to the Telpochkali, the House of the Youths, where they were trained in basic skills, carrying firewood, cleaning temples, and later serving as porters in military campaigns. Others, especially from noble families, went to the Kalmakak, where they studied ritual knowledge, learned hymns, and prepared to become priests or administrators. Picture a boy at dawn, sweeping the courtyard of a temple with a broom made from stiff grass stalks. The work is dull, repetitive, but spiritually loaded. Cleanliness was a form of devotion. Later he might carry bundles of firewood to the temple precinct, straining under the weight. These tasks were not glamorous, but they instilled discipline and they kept the machinery of the city moving. In both schools, the ultimate expectation was clear. Boys were to serve the gods, whether as warriors who captured prisoners or as priests who managed rituals. For girls, the training was different, but equally bound to obligation. They were taught to spin, weave, cook, and grind maize. Not optional skills, but sacred duties. Textiles were a form of tribute, and women's labor quite literally clothed the rituals of sacrifice. When we think of Tenochtitlan, we imagine the temples, but the true heartbeat of the city was the marketplace. The great market of Tlatelolco drew tens of thousands of people daily. Here, trade was not only economic, but political. Every stall represented labor. Cacao beans measured out as currency, maize piled in neat rows, clay pots stacked by size. If you walked through the market, you might notice cages holding turkeys, piles of obsidian blades, or stacks of firewood bundled with reeds. Each of these had ritual significance. Turkeys could be sacrificed. Obsidian blades were essential for ceremonies. Firewood was needed to keep the sacred hearths burning. And in the midst of this bustle, you might also see people whispering about the next festival. Everyone knew when sacrifices were coming. Everyone adjusted their daily purchases accordingly. If a family was chosen to host part of a ritual feast, they might have to buy extra maize or chili peppers to prepare tamales for the participants. Even here, in the most ordinary space, sacrifice hovered in the background like a shadow. For the captives, daily life before the sacrifice involved waiting, often long waiting. They were sometimes kept in holding areas, sometimes even integrated temporarily into the households of priests or nobles, accounts Aitu, a jest that captives could be well fed, dressed in costumes, and made to sing or dance before the day arrived. But not all were treated in such a way. Many were simply kept confined, guarded, and made to wait in uncertainty. They would hear the sounds of the city around them, the calls of market vendors, the songs of children practicing in the Kalmakak, the steady beat of the drum that marked time for the rituals. Every sound reminded them of the city's order, an order that would end with their death. You might imagine yourself in their place, the smell of copal incense wafting in, the muffled prayers of priests, the sound of water trickling through canals. All the while, you know the temple towers over you, and your fate is not in doubt. We rarely think about the logistics. A major festival might require dozens, even hundreds of sacrifices. That meant careful preparation. Obsidian knives had to be readied. Priests had to fast and abstain from certain foods in the days leading up to the event. Costumes had to be prepared from feathers, shells, and textiles. And there was the matter of disposal. After the sacrifice, bodies did not simply vanish. Some were buried, some were displayed, and in certain cases, flesh was consumed in ritual meals. The skull racks, the tsompantli, had to be maintained, cleaned, and expanded as needed. That required carpenters, laborers, and guards. So behind the dramatic scene that you imagine when you think of Aztec sacrifice, there was a world of minor but necessary chores: sharpening blades, gathering wood, weaving costumes, and cleaning up afterward. For the average resident of Tenochtitlan, participation was not optional. Families had to contribute to festivals, whether by providing food, labor, or offerings. Women might spend days preparing tamales, grinding maize until their hands were sore. Men might haul firewood into the temple precinct. Children were tasked with carrying water or sweeping ritual spaces. Participation meant belonging. And if your family failed to contribute, you risked dishonor, or worse, punishment. Everyone was bound together in the cycle, whether or not they stood on the temple steps themselves. Imagine a mother rising before dawn, the sky still dark, grinding maize on a metate stone, the repetitive sound echoing softly. She knows the tamales she prepares are not just for her family, but for the wider ritual community. Her labor, quiet and unacknowledged, sustains the system just as much as the priest's chant. It is tempting to think that fear dominated everything, but fear was only one layer. For many, there was also pride. To be chosen as a victim could be framed as an honor, especially if you were captured in war and given the chance to impersonate a god before death. Families could take pride in contributing to rituals, knowing they were helping to sustain the sun and the rains. At the same time, there must have been unease. What if the captives were not enough? What if the gods demanded more? What if your family's maize field yielded poorly and you could not pay your tribute? Anxiety was built into the system, but so was routine. Most days, people woke, ate, worked, and slept, comforted by the belief that the cycle continued. Sacrifice in the Aztec world was never just the sudden act at the top of the temple. It was the slow build-up of obligations, the endless chores that filled every day, the training of children, the bustle of markets, the discipline of priests, and the logistics of festivals. It was not extraordinary. It was ordinary, woven into everything from the way maize was ground to the way calendars were kept. And yet, as we leave this part of the story, one question hangs in the air. How did people reconcile the dull, heavy weight of obligation with the vivid, terrifying spectacle of the final moment? Did they see it as one seamless whole? Or did they, too, struggle to hold the pieces together in their minds? Imagine dawn breaking over the chinampas, those artificial islands built from mud and reeds in Lake Texcoco. The mist clings to the water as farmers step barefoot into the damp soil. The air smells of wet earth, maize stalks, and the faint salt tang of the lake. Here, on these long, narrow fields, the foundations of sacrifice were planted each day. Every tortilla eaten, every tamale prepared for a festival, every feast that accompanied a ritual depended on these plots. Farmers bent their backs, pushing digging sticks into the earth, planting maize, beans, and squash in intercropped rows. It wasn't just agriculture, it was cosmic duty. If the maize grew, the people could feed the warriors who captured victims, the priests who fasted before rituals, and the households that supported festivals. It is easy to imagine the grand temple, but harder to picture the countless hours of weeding, harvesting, and carrying baskets of maize by canoe to the city's markets. Yet without this steady work, the sacrifices could not take place. The gods might demand blood, but they also demanded tortillas, tamales, and offerings of food, all produced by hands that rarely saw the temple steps. From these fields came not only food, but tribute. Tribute lists preserved in codices tell us what subject towns were expected to deliver: baskets of maize, loads of beans, bolts of cotton, cacao beans, rubber balls, obsidian, even warriors' costumes. These tributes were not small gestures. They were calculated, regular, and enforced. Imagine the scene. Tribute bearers trudging along causeways, their loads heavy, their backs bent beneath woven frames. They might carry cloaks woven with rabbit fur, bird feathers sorted by color, or jaguar skins demanded by the capital. Alongside them, baskets of maize and cacao beans rattled as they walked. These goods arrived at warehouses in Tenochtitlan, where scribes and officials recorded them carefully. Some went directly to support the nobility, others were redistributed for festivals, and many were stored to be brought out at the right moment, when the gods were to be honored with sacrifice. In this way, even towns far from Tenochtitlan's heart contributed indirectly to the rituals. A bolt of cloth from a distant province might one day be wrapped around a captive before the sacrifice. A bag of cacao beans might fuel the priest who chanted through the night. A jaguar skin might decorate a warrior's costume during a ritual dance. The entire empire was pulled into this machinery. As the day of sacrifice approached, the machinery accelerated. Priests observed fasts, abstaining from salt, chili, and certain foods. Some pierced their ears or thighs with maguey spines, offering drops of their own blood to cleanse themselves. Costumes were checked, the great feather headdresses, the cloaks dyed with cochineal red, the shell ornaments. Musicians rehearsed their rhythms on drums and rattles because every step of the ritual had to align with the beat. Meanwhile, captives were prepared. If they were to impersonate gods, they were dressed in fine clothes, painted with symbols, and sometimes even allowed to marry or live as a deity for a short span. Others were kept in simpler conditions, their roles less exalted, but no less essential. And always behind the scenes, the city labored. Women prepared mountains of food for the ritual feasts, tamales filled with beans or amaranth, stews of turkey and maize, drinks of cacao mixed with water and flavored with chili or honey. Firewood was gathered in enormous quantities, because incense fires and cooking hearths needed to burn steadily throughout the ceremonies. Nothing about this was spontaneous. It was scheduled, prepared, and supplied with the same diligence you would expect of an army. When the day came, the entire city was drawn in. Drums beat from the temples, echoing across the lake. Crowds gathered in the plazas. Priests, their hair matted with blood from earlier acts of self-sacrifice, ascended the temple steps. Captives were led up in procession, their bodies painted, their hearts steady or trembling. Accounts differ in detail, but the broad outline remains clear. The victim was laid on a stone, his chest cut open with an obsidian blade, his heart lifted high to the sun. Blood spilled down the temple steps, visible to the crowd below. But while this moment shocks modern imagination, for the people present, it was only one part of a longer cycle. The heart was offered to the gods, but the body still had to be dealt with. Some were buried, some were flayed, and their skins worn by priests in ritual impersonation of deities. Some were dismembered, and some were consumed in ritual meals. And then came the cleaning. Blood had to be washed away, knives discarded, fires tended. The ceremony was spectacular, yes, but also messy, and the mess required labor. Ordinary people, temple attendants, apprentices, servants, were responsible for restoring order after the sacrifice ended. The aftermath of sacrifice is often left unspoken, but it mattered as much as the moment itself. The skulls of victims were sometimes displayed on racks, the tzompantli, where they were arranged in rows on wooden poles. Maintaining these displays took work. Skulls had to be cleaned, drilled, and positioned. Carpenters repaired the racks. Guards watched over them. In some festivals, flayed skins were worn by priests in public processions. This required preparation, handling, and eventual disposal, all tasks given to attendants. Imagine the quiet, methodical work of scraping, cleaning, and preparing skins, a job carried out not for glory but for necessity. And in some cases, flesh was cooked and consumed in tightly controlled ritual contexts. It was not cannibalism in the sense we might imagine, but part of a sacred economy. Portions of meat might be shared in small circles, linking families and lineages to the cosmic cycle. Preparing these meals required cooks, fuel, and utensils, just like any other feast. Behind the spectacle, the system relied on dozens of unseen hands making sure everything happened according to order. Think of the ordinary man or woman, far from the temple steps. Their role was not to wield the knife, but to sustain the system. They might weave a cloak destined for a victim. They might carry firewood to fuel the ceremonies. They might prepare food for the feasts, or sweep the temple courtyard after the rituals ended. Life did not pause for sacrifice. After the drums fell silent, people still had to paddle their canoes to the markets, tend their fields, and grind maize for the next meal. But the memory of the sacrifice lingered, woven into their sense of duty. It was proof that the gods were fed, that the sun would rise, that the rains might fall in their season. Children, too, absorbed these lessons. They watched processions, listened to the drums, and saw skulls displayed on racks. For them, this was normal, frightening perhaps, but also ordinary, part of the cycle of life. One of the overlooked realities is how constant the demand for victims was. With nearly every month of the ritual calendar requiring sacrifices, the empire had to secure a steady supply. That meant frequent wars, constant tribute, and a network of alliances and rivalries maintained through conflict. Wars were not always total destruction. Many were staged as flower wars, battles fought for the purpose of capturing prisoners rather than seizing land. Capturing enemies alive required skill and training, and it gave warriors prestige. Ut for the captives, it meant an inevitable journey towards sacrifice. Thus, the agricultural cycle, the tribute system, the training of youth, and the waging of war all converged at the temple. The machinery was vast, and every cog mattered. Sacrifice in the Aztec world was not a single act, but a system, a machinery sustained by fields, tribute, schools, markets, wars, and households. It required endless labor from countless unseen people, from the farmer in his chinampa to the woman grinding maize at dawn, from the tribute bearer walking the causeways to the apprentice priest sweeping the temple courtyard after the ceremonies. And yet, as we leave this section, one question remains unsettled. Did the people who carried out these countless tasks believe the system was sustainable forever? Or did some, in the quiet of their daily work, sense that the weight of such endless obligation might one day break? To understand the scale of Aztec sacrifice, you must step back and see the empire as a whole. Tenochtitlan was the center, but it drew its lifeblood from dozens of allied and conquered cities across the Valley of Mexico and beyond. Towns far from the lake still owed tribute, and often, part of that tribute was human. Imagine the scene in a provincial town. Local officials gathered lists of obligations: maize, beans, woven cloth, obsidian blades, firewood bundles, feather capes. Alongside these goods, captives might be selected or delivered. These were not always enemies taken in war. In some cases, communities were expected to provide individuals for sacrifice as part of their tribute. For a family in a distant town, this could mean seeing a son or daughter taken away, not in battle but through obligation. The system was not simply violent, it was administrative, woven into the paperwork of empire. Tribute records, warehouses, and distribution networks ensured that the capital had a steady stream of victims and supplies. Thus, sacrifice was not just a religious act, but an imperial one. Every subject town was reminded, through its obligations, that Tenochtitlan stood at the center of the cosmos. Because victims were always needed, war was constant. The so-called flower wars with Tlaxcala and other neighboring states were not intended to destroy, but to capture. Yet even when destruction was not the goal, these conflicts carried real costs. Men left their fields to campaign. Women and elders carried extra burdens of labor at home. The disruption of seasonal work could affect harvests, which in turn threatened the food supply. Tribute obligations did not pause for war. They had to be met regardless of hardship. And for the warriors themselves, the pressure was immense. A young man's reputation depended on capturing enemies. Failure meant dishonor. Success meant prestige, advancement, and sometimes a place in the warrior elite. For every captive brought back to Tenochtitlan, there was a family elsewhere who lost a son, a brother, or a father. This cycle bound entire regions together in a network of conflict, obligation, and ritual. For the ordinary residents of Tenochtitlan, life was not defined by daily sacrifices. Most days were spent farming, weaving, trading, or carrying out chores. Yet the presence of the temple, looming over the city, was constant. Its twin shrines, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, the rain god, reminded everyone that survival depended on satisfying both. The soundscape of the city reflected this. Drums and conch shells signaled ceremonies. Processions filled streets with color and noise. Even those not directly involved could not ignore it. For children, growing up beneath this rhythm, sacrifice was not an oddity. It was as ordinary as the turning of the seasons. And yet, the ordinary coexisted with the extraordinary. A woman grinding maize might pause, hearing the distant beat of drums. A fisherman casting nets into Lake Texcoco might look up to see smoke rising from the temple precinct. A merchant in the Tlatelolco market might see captives being paraded toward the steps. The rhythm of daily life folded the extraordinary into the ordinary. By the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was at its greatest extent. Tribute poured in from conquered lands, markets bustled with trade, and festivals filled the calendar. Sacrifice was central to this display of power. Visitors from distant towns could not ignore the sight of captives ascending the temple steps, the sound of drums echoing across the lake, the displays of skull racks in public plazas. These spectacles reinforced Tenochtitlan's dominance. They told allies and enemies alike that the city held the favor of the gods, that its rulers could command the sun to rise and the rains to fall. The empire's strength was measured not just in armies, but in the ability to sustain such costly, elaborate, and continuous rituals. But at the same time, this strength was fragile. It depended on endless streams of tribute, endless cycles of war, endless supplies of captives. The system had no pause button, no way to scale down. The machinery had to keep turning. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they encountered this system in full operation. Accounts from Hernán Cortés and Bernal Díaz del Castillo describe the shock of seeing skull racks and temples stained with blood. To them, it was evidence of barbarity. To the Aztecs, it was evidence of devotion. The Spanish, of course, brought their own forms of ritual violence, executions, inquisitions, and forced conversions. But they perceived Aztec sacrifice as alien. This difference became a justification for conquest. The Spaniards framed their campaign as not only political but spiritual, a mission to end what they saw as idolatry. For the Aztecs, the conquest brought catastrophe. Epidemics, warfare, and famine devastated the population. And with the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the machinery of sacrifice ground to a halt. Temples were toppled or repurposed, rituals banned, and the great Templo Mayor was dismantled. Yet even after the fall, echoes of the system remained. Families still told stories. Communities still remembered the festivals. Some rituals were reshaped under Catholic forms, processions, offerings, fasts. The idea that life was bound to obligation, that survival required devotion, did not disappear overnight. Archaeology today reveals the scale of the old system. Excavations in Mexico City uncover skull racks, ceremonial knives, caches of offerings buried beneath temples. These remains tell us not only of the rituals themselves, but of the endless labor behind them. The quarrying of stone, the weaving of cloth, the grinding of maize, the gathering of feathers. In this way, the legacy of sacrifice is not only in the blood spilled, but in the mundane work that made it possible. Looking back, it is clear that the system of sacrifice was both powerful and unsustainable. It tied together politics, economy, and religion in a way that gave the empire immense strength, but also made it inflexible. The demand for captives pushed constant warfare. The reliance on tribute strained distant provinces. The expectation of ritual precision left little room for change. When external forces arrived, Spanish armies, epidemic diseases, shifting alliances, the system could not adapt. The machinery was too rigid, too dependent on constant input. And so, within a few years, what had seemed eternal collapsed. Sacrifice in the Aztec world was not simply an act of violence. It was an entire system, built on fields of maize and networks of tribute, on schools that trained children and markets that bustled with trade, on priests who fasted and families who labored in silence. It was sustained not only by the blade, but by the broom, the matate stone, the tribute basket, and the reed canoe. For those who became victims, the end was sudden and public. But for everyone else, sacrifice was a constant presence woven into every corner of life. And so the question we leave with is this. If the Aztec world had survived unchanged, how long could this machinery have continued? Was it destined to collapse under its own weight? Or was it only the intrusion of foreign powers that brought it to an end? We've seen how daily life in Tenochtitlan revolved around sacrifice. But beyond the fields, markets, and temples, there was another machine at work, one that stretched across valleys and mountains, pulling people from their homes and sending them into the capital as offerings. These were the so-called flower wars, conflicts fought not to conquer, but to capture. And if you were caught in their path, your ordinary life could end suddenly, transformed into the long march toward the temple steps. In many parts of the world, wars are waged for land, wealth, or political control. The Aztecs fought for those reasons too, but layered onto that was a more pressing need, the demand for human lives to sustain the gods. The ritual calendar required sacrifices almost every month. To keep up with this demand, the empire needed a steady supply of captives. Tribute alone was not enough. Warfare filled the gap. The Xochitlcoatl, literally the War of Flowers, was designed with this purpose. The battles were formalized, arranged between the Aztecs and rival states such as Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and Cholula. Instead of trying to destroy an enemy, the goal was to capture warriors alive. This meant that battles were fought with tactics different from those intended for annihilation. Warriors trained not just to kill, but to subdue, to knock an enemy down, bind his arms, and drag him back to camp. For the Aztec warrior, success meant prestige and promotion. For the captive, it meant a one-way journey. This system demanded rigorous training. From youth, boys in the Telpochcali and Calmecac schools were drilled not only in endurance but in techniques of capture. Wooden swords edged with obsidian blades, macuahuitl, could wound severely, but in flower wars, the goal was often to disable rather than kill. Nets, ropes, and coordinated maneuvers were practiced. A boy's first camper, Eigen, was a test. If he captured an enemy, he could advance in status, earning the right to wear special costumes, eagle feathers, jaguar skins, or shell ornaments. These distinctions mattered. They marked a man's success not only as a warrior, but as a provider of victims for the gods. This meant that every battle was charged with personal ambition. Warriors strove to take captives because their future depended on it. And for those on the receiving end, it meant facing enemies motivated not just by defense of territory, but by the drive to seize living bodies. Imagine you are not a warrior, but a farmer in Tlaxcala, one of the states locked in constant flower wars with the Aztecs. Your life revolves around maize fields, family obligations, seasonal cycles. Yet you live with the knowledge that war could sweep through at almost any time. When Aztec forces approached, villages emptied, families fled, but not everyone escaped. Some were taken on the spot. Others were caught in battle when drafted into defending their town. For farmers untrained in warrior techniques, the odds of being captured alive were high. The threat hung over daily life like a shadow. It was not just hunger or drought you feared, but capture. The possibility that your ordinary existence could end with a sudden clash on the battlefield and a forced march to Tenochtitlan. Once captured, you were not immediately killed. Captives were valuable resources. They had to be kept alive for festivals, which might be months away. Warriors bound their prisoners and escorted them back to the capital, sometimes across long distances. The journey itself was grueling. Bound, marched, and guarded, captives were displayed as trophies. In some cases, warriors painted or decorated their prisoners to emphasize their role as offerings. For the captive, each step brought them closer not to freedom, but to ritual death. Imagine the monotony, long days of walking, tied or shackled, surviving on sparse food, sleeping under guard. At every step, the sound of drums and the sight of temples grew closer. Once in Tenochtitlan, the captives were integrated into the ritual calendar. A flower war fought in the spring might provide victims for summer ceremonies. Captives from one campaign could sustain multiple festivals, parceled out according to the schedule. For the priests and administrators, this was a matter of planning. How many victims would be needed for Tlacaxipehualistli? How many for Etzalcoatlistli? The numbers had to be matched with the supply. Behind the drama of sacrifice was the bureaucracy of warfare. This meant that the outcome of a flower war rippled through the empire. A successful campaign ensured that ceremonies could proceed smoothly. A poor harvest of captives might create tension, anxiety, or even pressure to fight again sooner than planned. From the victim's side, the experience was slow, drawn out, and unavoidable. Captivity was not just physical, but psychological. You were paraded, sometimes fed well, sometimes mocked, always marked as destined for death. Some captives were forced to impersonate gods, treated with honor in the short term, but knowing that honor would end at the altar. Others were kept in holding areas, listening to the daily sounds of the city, the calls of vendors in the markets, the beat of drums marking sacred times, all reminders that their lives were now aligned with an alien rhythm. There was little chance of escape. The city was surrounded by water, accessible only by guarded causeways. The presence of thousands of residents, all accustomed to seeing captives, made anonymity impossible. While the captives faced the blade, the system also strained those who captured them. Warriors had to leave their fields, their families, and risk their own lives in the process. If they failed to capture enemies, they lost honor. If they succeeded, they gained status, but at the cost of another's life. Families in towns like Tlaxi, Ala lived with the constant grief of losing relatives, and in Tenochtitlan, households lived with the burden of preparing food, costumes, and offerings to process each new wave of victims. The system consumed labor from every direction. The flower wars were not wars of conquest. They were harvests, designed to feed the machinery of sacrifice. For the Aztec warrior, they were paths to honor. For the state, they were ways to sustain the gods. But for the captive, they were a net that closed around you, dragging you from your home and planting you in the ritual calendar of an empire not your own. And so the question lingers, what did it feel like, in those final days of freedom, to know that the wars raging around you were not to protect or destroy your city, but to seize bodies like yours, to be carried off alive as offerings? For the Aztec warrior, preparing for a flower war was not merely a matter of sharpening blades. It began with discipline drilled from childhood. Boys raised in the Telpochcali schools were hardened by carrying firewood, hauling water, cleaning temples, and learning to endure hunger and exhaustion. Physical labor prepared them for the hardships of campaign life, long marches, little sleep, and exposure to the elements. But it was also about psychology. Teachers emphasized bravery, composure, and ritual discipline. To falter in battle meant not just personal failure, but dishonor for one's entire lineage. Elders told boys that their ancestors had fed the gods with blood. It was now their turn to continue the chain. By adolescence, a boy's identity was inseparable from this mission. He was not just a farmer's son, not just a student. He was a future provider of captives. When the time came to march, rituals marked the departure. Priests fasted, burned incense, and consulted omens. Warriors painted their faces with symbolic patterns, applied chalk, soot, or red pigments that identified their rank and their godly patron. Offerings were made to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. His hunger was insatiable, and warriors were told they carried not just their weapons, but the responsibility of keeping the cosmos in motion. Without captives, the ceremonies would falter, and without ceremonies, the sun itself might fail to rise. This cosmic weight meant that even the smallest skirmish carried enormous significance. To step into battle was to step into the machinery that sustained the world. The Maquahuitl, the famous wooden club edged with obsidian, was not designed to pierce like a sword. Its broad edges could slash deeply, but it was also a tool of control. With a blow to the legs or shoulders, an enemy could be disabled without being killed. Warriors often use the flat of the weapon or the shaft to knock down opponents. Alongside the Maquahuitl, warriors carried nets, lassos, and spears. These tools were not secondary, but essential. They turned combat into a hunt. Once an enemy was subdued, he could be bound quickly with cords. The battlefield, then, was not a place of indiscriminate slaughter, but of calculated targeting. Each warrior sought not simply to cut down enemies, but to claim them alive. This created a strange rhythm. Moments of violence followed by the act of binding and dragging, sometimes in the middle of ongoing chaos. Battles often opened with the beating of drums and the blowing of conch shells. War was as much performance as combat. Warriors advanced in colorful regalia, with banners fluttering on their backs, not camouflage but display. These banners identified rank and unit, making the battlefield a living procession of status and symbolism. Formations shifted depending on terrain, but the focus was on coordinated strikes. Veteran warriors led charges, while novices were positioned to support, observe, and attempt captures. For a youth, capturing his first prisoner meant elevation in rank. For veterans, taking multiple captives secured prestige, land, or noble titles. The drive to capture made the battlefield a place of competition as well as cooperation. Warriors vied to secure victims, knowing that others were watching. In this sense, battles were also public stages for ambition. From the perspective of a captured fighter, the experience was terrifyingly quick. One moment you were holding your shield, struggling in formation. The next, you were struck down, tangled in a net, or clubbed in the legs. Before you could recover, several enemies might be upon you, binding your arms and dragging you away. The humiliation was immediate. To be captured alive was to be stripped of honor, especially in cultures where bravery in battle was prized. Tlaxcalan or Huexotzincan captives might know instantly what awaited them: the march to Tenochtitlan, the role of victim in the festivals. Even if you tried to resist, the numbers against you made escape unlikely. After battle, warriors carried their captives back. This march could last days or even weeks, depending on where the fighting took place. Captives were bound with cords or wooden yokes around their necks. Sometimes they were tied to poles carried by teams of warriors, a physical display of victory. Along the way, captives were jeered at by villagers, sometimes pelted with dirt or mocked. Warriors, in contrast, returned to cheering families. The sight of men carrying captives home was not just personal triumph, but a communal reassurance that the gods would be fed, the cosmos maintained. For the captive, every step reinforced a new reality. He was no longer a member of his community, but a resource of the Aztec state. Behind every warrior stood his family. Success in battle reflected not only on the individual, but on parents, siblings, and kin. Mothers were told their sons' courage ensured the sun's rising. Fathers reminded boys that cowardice would shame their ancestors. This meant that warriors marched to war under immense social pressure. Failure to bring back captives could stall a man's career, reduce his prospects for marriage, or leave his household without prestige. Victories, on the other hand, elevated entire families. Parents of successful warriors might receive gifts of food or textiles from neighbors, and their standing in community rituals improved. Thus, every battle was a test not just of individual skill, but of a family's honor. Once in Tenochtitlan, captives were delivered to priests who recorded totems. Hem assigned them to festivals and determined their roles. Some were slated for immediate ceremonies, others were held for months. The priest's job was administrative as much as spiritual, ensuring that the supply of victims matched the ritual calendar. Captives were sometimes kept in temple precincts, sometimes distributed to warrior households. In either case, they lived under guard, their movements tightly controlled. Food and clothing were provided, but freedom was gone. The priests also determined whether captives would impersonate gods in ritual dramas, a role that temporarily elevated them before the final act of sacrifice. This was perhaps the most cruel paradox, honor that masked inevitability. Day-to-day life as a captive varied, but always circled the same destiny. Some were forced to dance in rehearsals for ceremonies, learning the steps of a ritual they knew would end with their deaths. Others were kept in holding areas, listening to the daily cycles of the city, the pounding of hammers in workshops, the chatter of vendors in the market, the endless sound of drums marking sacred hours. The city's scale itself was overwhelming. Tenochtitlan, with its causeways, canals, and towering temples, was unlike the smaller towns many captives came from. Even before reaching the altar, they were immersed in a world designed to dwarf them, a reminder that they were in the hands of powers beyond escape. For ordinary citizens, the arrival of captives was routine, but it carried weight. Market gossip might focus on how many captives had been brought in, or whether upcoming festivals would be adequately supplied. Families who had sent warriors to battle watched closely. Had their sons returned with trophies? Were they rising in status? For priests, the stakes were cosmic. A shortfall in captives meant potential disruption in ceremonies. In a society where divine order was linked to the cycles of nature, this was not a trivial problem. Drought, famine, or disease could be interpreted as signs of insufficient offerings. The machinery of war, then, was not just about feeding gods, but about reassuring the people that the world would continue. The flower wars were less about conquest than choreography, a grim dance in which warriors sought to seize, priests to schedule, and captives to endure. Every part of the system, from battlefield training to temple administration, was designed to transform living people into ritual resources. And yet this system created a contradiction. If captives were so essential, what happened in years when battles yielded too few? Did shortages ever strain the empire's confidence, or push leaders toward desperate measures? The Aztec state had built itself on a cycle of obligation. The gods demanded nourishment, and humans provided it through warfare. But this dependency carried risks. If a campaign failed, if warriors returned without enough captives, ceremonies had to be adjusted or reduced. Priests were left scrambling, rulers searching for excuses. A bad harvest could be explained away as poor rains or unfavorable winds, but people also looked to the temples. If the sun's rise was linked to sacrifice, then shortages carried cosmic implications. Every missed captive threatened not just ritual, but the very legitimacy of the state. The small highland state of Tlaxcala is one of the most striking examples of how politics and ritual intertwined. Despite decades of Aztec campaigns, Tlaxcala was never fully conquered. Historians have long debated why. One explanation is strategic stalemate. Tlaxcala was difficult to subdue due to its rugged terrain and determined resistance. Another is intentional. The Aztecs may have deliberately left Tlaxcala independent, ensuring a permanent source of enemies to fight and captives to take. The arrangement created a peculiar relationship. Battles between Aztecs and Tlaxcalans were frequent, brutal, and real, yet they were also ritualized, with both sides aware that captives were the true prize. This meant that the two polities were locked in an enduring cycle of bloodletting, their populations feeding each other's gods. From the Tlaxcalan side, fighting the Aztecs was both survival and defiance. Their resistance preserved independence, but it also tied them to the Aztec ritual system. In later centuries, this bitterness would shape their alliance with the Spanish, when they saw an opportunity to break the cycle once and for all. Behind every flower war were months of preparation, not unlike that of a harvest. Grain had to be stored to feed warriors. Farmers contributed food as tribute, their maize and beans carried into storehouses that provisioned armies. Textile weavers produced uniforms, cloaks, and banners. Woodcutters prepared spear shafts and shields. Every soldier marching out represented a vast support network of ordinary labor. The battles may have been ritual in purpose, but the labor that sustained them was practical, daily, and mundane. Women in households ground maize into tortillas, dried food for travel, and brewed pulque to energize men before departure. Porters carried supplies along the roads. If wars ended without sufficient captives, the frustration was felt all the way down this chain. Families might grumble, "Why had we given food, labor, and cloth, only to see the campaign fail?" The ordinary people carried the costs of empire, but the rewards were largely symbolic. Reassurance that the gods were fed. Prestige for noble warriors. The Aztec world suffered real droughts and famines. Crops sometimes withered under irregular rains, and food shortages left communities vulnerable. In such moments, the contradiction between earthly hunger and divine hunger became stark. When maize was scarce, why continue sending men into battle for prisoners rather than focusing solely on survival? For the state, the answer was simple. The famine itself proved the gods were displeased, and the solution was more sacrifice, not less. But for farmers watching children weaken, this logic could feel cruelly inverted. Food was needed to sustain the living, yet the rulers doubled down on feeding the gods. The people endured this paradox, trapped between the practical need to eat and the ideological demand to sacrifice. Not all captives came from flower wars. Provinces subjugated by the empire also contributed prisoners as tribute. Subject towns sometimes delivered youths or criminals to the capital, sparing their own soldiers from marching. These arrangements further entwined politics with ritual. Tribute obligations were not just maize, cotton, or cacao, but human lives. When shortages loomed, tribute demands increased. Governors pressed their towns to hand over more bodies, often straining local communities. This could provoke resentment, and in some cases, rebellions. People might ask, why should our sons and brothers vanish into the maw of the temple, while nobles in Tenochtitlan gained glory? Such murmurs rarely overturned the system, but they reveal the fragility beneath the empire's grandeur. The machinery of sacrifice depended on constant flows of tribute and captives. Any disruption threatened the whole. Priests felt the strain most acutely. Their calendars were fixed, festivals immovable. Gods had appointed days, seasons, and moments that had to be observed. When captives were short, improvisation followed. In some cases, substitution rituals were used, animals sacrificed instead of humans, or symbolic offerings of paper and bloodletting from nobles. But these substitutions were considered temporary and inadequate. The gods might accept them in the short term, but never indefinitely. The weight of failure fell on the priests, who were seen as intermediaries between heaven and earth. If crops failed again after substitutions, people whispered, had the priests failed? Was the empire losing divine favor? Such anxieties show that even in a society committed to sacrifice, there was no absolute stability. The system relied on constant replenishment, and every shortage opened cracks in confidence. For captives, shortages could extend the period of waiting. A man might be seized in battle but not sacrificed immediately. He could be held for weeks or months until the right festival arrived, or until enough others had been gathered for a proper ceremony. This limbo carried its own cruelty. Captives lived in the shadow of inevitable death, but without knowing the date. Each sunrise brought dread. Was this the day? Or would they be fed, clothed, and held another cycle, forced to rehearse dances or impersonate deities before the end? In this way, shortages prolonged suffering, turning men into living reminders of the empire's dependence on ritual. Military failure had political costs. A ruler who failed to secure captives risked appearing weak. Noble families whose sons returned empty-handed saw their prestige falter. Rivals at court could use such moments to question leadership, whispering that the gods might favor another. The empire was vast, but its cohesion depended on shared belief in its cosmic mission. Shortages and failures strained that belief. Provinces sometimes rebelled, citing exhaustion from tribute and resentment at endless wars. Leaders in Tenochtitlan had to respond with more campaigns, creating a cycle of pressure that never ceased. The Flower Wars sustained the empire, but they also exposed its vulnerabilities. Every shortage revealed the delicate balance between ritual, politics, and survival. Tlaxcala's stubborn independence, provincial resentment, and the contradictions of famine all pointed to cracks beneath the surface. And yet, the Aztec state pressed on, insisting that the gods' hunger outweighed all earthly concerns. But one cannot help but wonder, when shortages grew too great, when confidence faltered too deeply, did people quietly question the very foundation of their world? The Aztec Empire is remembered for its great markets, its architecture, its canals, and its art. Yet to its neighbors and to history, the practice of ritual war is one of its most distinctive features. The Xochitlal, the Flower Wars, were not simply battles fought for territory. They were contests waged to satisfy gods, to sustain the rhythm of festivals, and to reaffirm the structure of society. For the Aztecs, these wars were normal. Just as farmers prepared for the planting season, just as women wove cloth or ground maize each morning, warriors prepared for ritual war. The cycle was predictable, embedded in calendars and tied to festivals. It was not seen as extraordinary. It was life. But legacies are often measured not by what a people accept, but by what outsiders remember. And outsiders, Tlaxcalans, Spaniards, later historians, saw the Flower Wars as both extraordinary and terrible. For Aztec nobles, the Flower Wars became a proving ground. To capture an enemy alive was more prestigious than to kill him outright. A warrior's rank, his rights to wear certain garments, his privileges in society, all were tied to success in battle. This made the wars central to identity. A man's reputation in his family, his neighborhood, even his own self-respect, could hinge on his ability to deliver captives. Failure meant humiliation, while success elevated him among peers. Boys raised in the Calmecac or Telpochcali were taught from early age that their lives would be measured against the standard of the battlefield. Thus, Flower Wars became not only political instruments, but personal destinies. They were woven into how Aztec men understood their purpose and how Aztec society judged them. The strange balance with Tlaxcala shaped Aztec identity in another way. To leave an enemy unconquered, deliberately or not, was a rare choice for an expansionist empire. Tlaxcal stood as both foil and partner, a reminder that the Aztec world was not omnipotent, that defiance endured. For generations, young Aztec warriors expected to fight Tlaxcalans. Songs, stories, and speeches framed Tlaxcala as the testing ground, the place where true bravery was proven. This enmity became almost mythic, shaping collective memory. When the Spanish arrived, Tlaxcala's independence proved decisive. Their alliance with the foreigners was born from centuries of bitterness. Without the Flower Wars, the political map of central Mexico might have looked very different. The endurance of Tlaxcala was both a testament to Aztec pragmatism and a seed of their undoing. Over time, ritual war strained the empire. Tribute demands grew heavier, provinces grew weary, and the constant need for captives became a burden that never ended. The Aztec system was brilliant in its ability to coordinate labor, logistics, and ritual. Roads connected provinces, storehouses kept food flowing, armies marched on schedule. But such efficiency came at a cost. People at the edges of empire resented their role as sources of tribute and bodies. They saw Tenochtitlan's splendor as built upon their exhaustion. This fatigue is a quiet legacy of the Flower Wars. The grandeur of the capital was purchased with the sacrifices of others. The resentment this created would later make Spanish alliances possible, as discontented provinces sought escape from the endless cycle of tribute and blood. When Hernán Cortés and his men witnessed Aztec sacrifice, they were horrified. Accounts describe their shock at hearts torn out. Bodies rolled down temple steps. To the Spaniards, it confirmed their belief that they had encountered a people who needed salvation. Yet what they did not see was the deeper system, the way ritual war tied society together, the daily labor that supported it, the symbolic ways it carried. To the Spanish, it was only brutality. To the Aztecs, it was obligation, even necessity. This gap in perception would shape history. The Spaniards used horror as justification for conquest, framing themselves as destroyers of barbarism. The Flower Wars became evidence in their narrative, a symbol of what they believed they had ended. Even after the conquest, the memory of ritual war lingered. Indigenous chroniclers, writing under colonial oversight, recorded both pride and shame. Some emphasized the glory of warriors, the courage of men who captured enemies alive. Others emphasized the suffering of captives, the relentless demand for sacrifice. For centuries, the Flower Wars became shorthand for Aztec culture in the European imagination, a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Yet modern scholarship reveals more complexity. These wars were part of a wider web of political control, economic exchange, and cultural identity. They were not endless massacres, but structured, ritualized events embedded in daily life. Looking back, the Flower Wars appear paradoxical. On one hand, they reveal the strength of the Aztec system, its ability to mobilize people, to integrate warfare into society, to give meaning to individual lives within a cosmic frame. On the other hand, they reveal fragility, dependence on constant warfare, resentment among subjects, and the danger of failing to meet divine expectations. The Aztecs built their world on the premise that the gods required nourishment through blood. This gave coherence to their state, but it also locked them into a cycle they could not escape. Every generation had to renew the offering. Every festival had to be met. There was no end point, no final victory. The Flower Wars did not collapse the empire on their own, but they shaped its identity, strained its people, and prepared the ground for its downfall. When the Spanish and their allies arrived, they stepped into a world already weary from endless cycles of tribute and sacrifice. And yet, to dismiss the system as only cruelty would be to miss its meaning. For the Aztecs, the Flower Wars were as natural as the seasons, as inevitable as the sunrise. They were not madness, but order, a way to bind society to the cosmos. Their legacy is thus twofold, a reminder of human ingenuity in creating meaning from conflict, and a caution about systems that consume more than they can sustain. The flowers of war bloomed for centuries, but in the end, they withered under the weight of their own demands. The Flower Wars left behind more than captives. They delivered human lives into a vast system of ritual that stretched across Tenochtitlan. To understand why it mattered, we need to step away from the battlefield and into the machinery of sacrifice itself. The great temple of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor, dominated the island city. Twin staircases rose steeply, each leading to a shrine at the summit. One for Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, the other for Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture. From a distance, the temple stood as a pyramid of stone, its base broad, its sides sharply ascending, painted in red and white. This was the center of ritual life. It was not only a religious site, but a logistical hub. The temple grounds were large, surrounded by walls that enclosed multiple structures, smaller temples, schools, priestly residences, and storage areas. On festival days, thousands gathered, filling the plaza. The sounds of drums and flutes echoed across the water, carrying to the chinampas, the causeways, even to the shores of Lake Texcoco. Sacrifice was not random violence. It was orchestrated by a professional class of priests. At the top stood the Quetzalcoatl Tlamatcasqui, the high priest of the sun god, and the Huitzilopochtli Tlenamacac, high priest of Huitzilopochtli. Beneath them were ranks of assistants, each with specific duties. Some priests specialized in chanting prayers. Others were trained to wield the sacrificial knife. Others prepared captives, washing, dressing, and painting them for their role. Still others maintained the temple itself, cleaning, repairing, and ensuring that offerings were in place. Priests were recognizable by their appearance. They wore black robes, often matted with soot. Their long hair, worn uncut, became stiff with dried blood from past rituals. Their bodies bore the marks of penance, cuts, scars, and in some oses, calloused skin from carrying maguey spines for self-piercing. At the heart of sacrifice was the knife. These were made of obsidian, a volcanic glass found in central Mexico. Obsidian flakes could be sharper than modern steel, but they were brittle. Each knife was carefully shaped, its blade designed to pierce quickly through flesh. Knives were not the only tools. Wooden racks held captives. Straps of leather or fiber-bound wrists and ankles. Braziers of incense filled the air with copal smoke. A resin burned in nearly every ceremony. Large drums called huehuetl kept a slow rhythm, guiding the pace of ritual. Offerings also required containers, clay vessels for food, gourds filled with amaranth dough shaped into effigies, baskets of flowers, and bundles of paper strips soaked in blood. Everything had its place, each item recorded and prepared. Once delivered to the temple, captives were not immediately killed. They were often held for days or even weeks, depending on the timing of festivals. Some were kept in cages or guarded chambers near the temple complex. During this time they were washed, fed, and in some cases adorned. Accounts describe captives dressed in the likeness of gods, painted with symbolic colors, and given feathers, jewelry, or headdresses. For a time, they were not merely prisoners, they were embodiments of divine forces. Some captives participated in rituals before their death. They might dance, sing, or play symbolic games in the plaza. These acts were not entertainment, but parts of the transformation process, moving the captive from human status to divine offering. When the day arrived, the process was methodical. Drums began before dawn. Smoke rose from braziers. Crowds gathered in the plaza, pressing against the temple walls. Priests led the captive up the steep steps, each pace deliberate, accompanied by music and chants. At the summit, the captive was laid upon a stone slab. 4 priests held the limbs, a 5th positioned the head, and the 6th, the officiant, wielded the knife. With a swift cut beneath the ribcage, the chest was opened. The heart, still beating, was lifted high, offered to the sun, then placed in a vessel. The body did not remain. It was rolled down the staircase, tumbling to the base where attendants retrieved it. Some parts were buried near the temple, others displayed, and in certain cases, flesh was consumed in ritual meals shared among warriors and priests. Sacrifice left physical traces. The temple steps stained dark. The ground at the base grew slick. Attendants carried water to wash stone surfaces. Others collected remains, storing them in designated areas. Skulls might be mounted on the tzompantli, the skull rack, a wooden structure with horizontal poles where heads were displayed in rows. Cleaning was itself a ritual. The temple could not remain defiled. Ash, flowers, and fresh paint covered traces of blood. The next ceremony required order and clarity, not lingering disorder. For those present, sacrifice was not an isolated spectacle. It was part of a cycle that repeated with every festival. The Aztec calendar included dozens of major ceremonies, each with its own rituals, each demanding offerings. Some months focused on rain, others on fertility, others on war. In nearly all, human blood was required. Thus, the machinery of sacrifice never rested. Priests trained constantly. Storehouses ensured supplies of incense, food, and garments. Warriors delivered captives at regular intervals. Temple attendants maintained the site between festivals. Life in Tenochtitlan revolved around the certainty that another sacrifice was always approaching. Beyond priests and warriors, ordinary people supported this system. Farmers supplied maize for ritual meals, terre-shaped vessels. Women wove garments and headdresses. Fishermen delivered offerings of water creatures. Even children participated, carrying flowers or playing roles in processions. Sacrifice was not the work of a few. It was the work of an entire society. Each contribution, no matter how small, sustained the structure. The machinery of sacrifice seems overwhelming in its precision. Yet one question remains: how did the Aztecs sustain the sheer scale of ritual year after year across decades without collapse? The answer lies not only in belief, but in the hidden logistics of tribute, trade, and supply networks. The silent systems that kept the blood flowing. Sacrifice, for all its symbolic weight, depended on mundane materials. Knives dulled, garments wore out, incense burned away. Captives required food, water, and containment. To keep the machinery turning, the Aztec Empire wove together a system of tribute and trade that reached across central Mexico. At the core of this system was tribute. Conquered provinces did not simply yield warriors for sacrifice. They delivered goods on a strict schedule. Tribute lists, recorded in codices such as the Mendoza Codex, detail what each province owed. These obligations included maize, beans, chili peppers, cotton, cacao, feathers, animal skins, and crafted goods. Certain provinces specialized in particular products. Xoconoco, far to the south, delivered cacao beans, precious for both ritual drinks and as currency. Others supplied obsidian for knives, salt for food preparation, or cloth for garments. Tribute was not occasional. It was regular, measured in intervals of 80 days or other calendar cycles. Without this steady flow, the rituals of Tenochtitlan would have faltered. The empire's expansion was not simply about territory. It was about sustaining the supply chain of ritual. Tenochtitlan managed tribute with care. Goods arriving at the city were stored in warehouses near the ceremonial precinct. These were not casual structures. They were built to keep items organized, accessible, and ready for use during festivals. Maize was stored in granaries, cotton in woven bundles, cacao in clay jars sealed against moisture. Priests and administrators tracked quantities, ensuring that nothing spoiled or disappeared. When festivals approached, supplies were distributed: garments to dress captives, food for offerings, incense for burning, feathers for adornment. The system resembled an economy of ritual. What came in from distant provinces did not remain untouched. It was transformed into offerings, costumes, meals, and sacred objects, all consumed in the cycle of sacrifice. Tribute alone could not cover every need. Markets within the empire filled the gaps. The largest of these was Tlatelolco, the twin city to Tenochtitlan. Here, thousands of vendors gathered daily. They sold food, tools, textiles, animals, and luxury goods. For ritual purposes, priests and attendants purchased items that were not supplied through tribute or that required immediate availability. At Tlatelolco, one might see bundles of herbs for cleansing rituals, gourds for carrying liquids, or specialized paints for body decoration. Payment was made in cacao beans, cotton cloth, or other standard units of exchange. The market ensured flexibility. If tribute failed, commerce stepped in. Obsidian, the lifeblood of sacrificial blades, required its own system. Quarries at places like Pachuca and Otumba provided the raw material. Workers shaped it into flakes or cores, which were then knapped into knives by skilled artisans. Knives were not endlessly reusable. Each cut dulled the edge. Each ritual demanded sharpness. This meant a constant flow of obsidian tools was necessary. Tribute lists often included obsidian as part of the quota. Without this material, the very act of opening a chest would falter. Captives could not be sacrificed immediately upon arrival. Many were kept for days or weeks, sometimes longer. During this period, they needed food and water. Records suggest they were fed tamales, beans, and maize porridge, simple sustenance that required storage and preparation. This too drew on tribute. Maize and beans, the staples of central Mexico, were supplied in enormous quantities. Farmers across the empire, working chinampas, hillside terraces, and valley fields, produced more than for themselves. Their labor, taxed in kind, became the fuel that kept captives alive until their final moment. Sacrifices required more than bare bodies. Captives were dressed in ritual attire, often in the likeness of gods. This meant constant demand for textiles, feathers, and paint. Cotton cloth came largely from warmer provinces to the south. Woven into mantles or loincloths, it formed the base of ritual garments. Feathers arrived from distant lands, quetzal feathers from the tropical forests, heron feathers from wetlands, eagle down from highland nests. Each feather was plucked, bundled, and carried across miles to Tenochtitlan. Dyes and paints, too, came from diverse sources. Cochineal insects for red, indigo plants for blue, chalk and clay for white, charcoal for black. Mixed and applied, they transformed captives into living symbols. Behind every ritual stood thousands of unnamed laborers. Farmers bent over chinampas, planting maize in narrow plots. Hunters trapped birds for feathers. Miners chipped obsidian from stone outcrops. Weavers sat at backstrap looms, producing lengths of cloth. Canoe paddlers transported tribute across Lake Texcoco, docking at causeways and canals. These people rarely witnessed the rituals their work sustained, yet their daily effort made them participants. In effect, the empire's population fed the temple. Sacrifice was not only the priest's act, but society's collective labor, funneled into ritual through tribute and trade. Consider the rhythm of an 80-day cycle. From a province hundreds of kilometers away, bundles of cotton cloth were prepared. Officials counted and marked them. Carriers set out, walking narrow roads, bearing loads on their backs, supported by tump lines across their foreheads. Day after day, they trudged, sleeping in way stations, eating simple meals. At last, they reached Tenochtitlan, where officials checked the delivery and moved it to storage. This cycle never ceased. As soon as one tribute payment was completed, preparation for the next began. Provinces lived under the constant demand of the empire's ritual appetite. Failure could mean punishment, increased levies, or military retaliation. Tribute was not only goods, it was also people. Some provinces were obliged to deliver captives for sacrifice, either taken in their own wars or seized in punitive campaigns. This requirement was heavy. It meant not only supplying warriors to fight, but producing a steady stream of prisoners. In practice, this reinforced Aztec dominance. Provinces could not merely submit once. They had to provide continually, tying their survival to the empire's ritual needs. For the Aztecs, this ensured that festivals never lacked victims. Taken together, tribute and trade created what might be called a ritual economy. Goods moved not for personal profit, but for sacred obligation. A feather from a southern jungle, an obsidian knife from a quarry, a tamale cooked in a distant village, all converged on the temple steps. This economy was enormous. It spanned ecosystems, climates, and languages. It required coordination, enforcement, and constant vigilance. Yet it held, year after year, sustaining the spectacle that defined Aztec power. Still, even the most efficient system faced strain. Tribute demands weighed heavily on subject provinces. Markets fluctuated. Obsidian quarries could falter. What happened when the flow wavered? How did the Aztecs respond to shortages, rebellions, or disruptions that threatened their sacred economy? The system that sustained Aztec sacrifice looked unshakable on the surface. Tribute arrived, markets thrived, and rituals proceeded with precision. Yet beneath the appearance of stability lay fragility. No empire could demand so much, so regularly, without provoking resistance. For subject provinces, tribute was relentless. Every 80 days, bundles had to be ready: maize, cotton, cacao, feathers, obsidian, garments. The work fell on farmers, artisans, hunters, and carriers whose own needs often went unmet. When harvests were poor, the burden grew intolerable. A drought could shrink maize yields. A plague of insects might devour beans. Yet tribute demands did not diminish. Local officials had to find ways to meet quotas, often by stripping their own communities bare. Over time, this produced fatigue. Not sudden rebellion, but simmering discontent. People resented that their grain fed distant captives instead of their children, that their feathers adorned sacrificial victims instead of clothing their families. Evidence suggests that shortages were sometimes met with substitutions. If one province could not supply cotton, it might offer cloth of a lesser material. If cacao was scarce, officials might deliver smaller quantities. These adjustments were tolerated only to a point. The empire depended on a certain rhythm of supplies: incense, knives, garments, food. These were not optional. Rituals had fixed calendars. If the materials failed, the ceremonies faltered, and a failed ceremony threatened the cosmic balance. Priests were acutely aware of this danger. The rituals were not symbolic flourishes. They were obligations to the gods. If blood did not flow, if offerings were insufficient, the sun itself was at risk. Shortages thus rippled outward into existential fear. Some provinces resisted more directly. The Tlaxcalans, never fully subdued, refused tribute altogether. Their defiance forced the Aztecs into the so-called Flower Wars, ritualized conflicts fought in part to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Other provinces, temporarily rebellious, disrupted tribute routes. Carriers could be attacked, warehouses raided, deliveries delayed. These disruptions required military campaigns to restore flow. Each rebellion was more than political. It was a threat to the ritual economy. Beyond goods, tribute of captives faced its own vulnerabilities. A province tasked with delivering prisoners might struggle if wars yielded fewer captives than expected. Warriors had to risk themselves repeatedly, straining communities. This difficulty reinforced the value of the Flower Wars. By staging ongoing conflicts with Tlaxcala and other independent neighbors, the Aztecs ensured a more predictable stream of captives. But this too carried cost. Warriors bled, families worried, fields went untended while men fought to seize victims. The Valley of Mexico was a rich agricultural zone, but it was not limitless. Chinampas on Lake Texcoco's shallows produced remarkable yields, yet they required constant maintenance. Canals clogged, lake levels fluctuated, salinity crept in. A bad season could shrink food stores. When famine struck, as in the early 1450s, when frost and drought ruined harvests, tribute could not be met. The famine left many starving, forcing the empire to seek imports of maize from distant provinces. Such crises laid bare the system's dependence on stable climate and abundant labor. Even when food was available, labor could strain. Carriers bore loads over long distances. A journey from the Gulf Coast to Tenochtitlan might take weeks. Along the way, carriers ate the very food they transported, requiring careful accounting. Artisans too faced strain. Feather workers needed constant supply of rare plumes. Obsidian nappers orked continually to keep up with demand. Weavers produced mantles, only to see them vanish into ritual fire. For these workers there was no escape. Tribute was enforced. Officials counted, tallied, and punished. Yet the toll on their lives, exhaustion, scarcity, resentment, remained hidden behind the spectacle of sacrifice. The empire enforced compliance with severity. Tribute officials checked deliveries with precision. If a province failed, penalties followed. Leaders might be humiliated, beaten, or executed. Tribute demands could even be increased as punishment. At times, entire communities were uprooted. The Aztecs practiced resettlement, moving rebellious populations closer to the capital or dispersing them among loyal provinces. This broke local networks and ensured obedience. But it also disrupted production, scattering the very workers whose labor sustained tribute. One of the system's greatest pressures came from the ritual calendar itself. Ceremonies could not be postponed indefinitely. The Xiupohualli, 365-day solar calendar, and Tonalpohualli, 260-day ritual calendar, dictated precise dates. If captives were lacking, if materials had not arrived, priests faced impossible choices. Did they proceed with fewer victims? Did they substitute offerings? Or did they risk the wrath of the gods by delaying? Some chronicles hint that substitutions occurred, dough figures shaped like humans, adorned and treated as offerings in place of real bodies. Yet these were exceptions, not norms. For the most part, the system bent under strain, but did not break. Tribute strain also shaped politics. Rulers of Tenochtitlan had to balance demands with diplomacy. Too much pressure risked revolt. Too little tribute threatened rituals. The Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, had to negotiate divisions of tribute. Texcoco and Tlacopan resented Tenochtitlan's dominance, sometimes accusing it of hoarding the richest goods. Thus, the ritual economy not only bound provinces but also tested the alliance. Disputes over tribute could strain relationships at the very core of Aztec power. Seen from a distance, the empire appears orderly. Goods flowing in, captives delivered, rituals performed. But up close, the edges frayed. Farmers struggled, carriers tired, provinces wavered, rebellions flared, famines struck. The system endured because priests, warriors, and rulers insisted it must. The gods demanded blood, the sun demanded nourishment. Failure was unthinkable. So even under strain, the machinery ground forward, fueled by fear as much as devotion. Yet one must wonder, how long could such a system last? How many burdens could farmers bear? How many rebellions could be suppressed? How many famines endured before the ritual economy collapsed under its own weight? The Aztec sacrificial system was more than a ritual of blood. It was an economy, a machine of tribute, logistics, and labor. Its reach extended into fields, markets, workshops, warehouses, and roads. To understand its legacy, one must see both its achievements and its fragility. For nearly a century, from the mid-1400s until the Spanish conquest in 1521, the Aztec tribute system operated with remarkable efficiency. Carriers marched in regular cycles. Tribute officials compiled precise records. Markets in Tlatelolco offered goods that had traveled hundreds of miles. Warehouses in Tenochtitlan brimmed with food, clothing, incense, obsidian, feathers, and captives. Rituals proceeded according to the calendar, rarely interrupted. The priests had what they needed, not because it appeared magically, but because thousands of ordinary people toiled to provide it. Farmers bent over chinampas, weavers wove, hunters stalked birds for feathers, carriers sweated under loads of maize and cacao. The spectacle of sacrifice depended on this hidden labor. Without it, the rituals could not have continued so regularly, nor with such scale. Sacrifice also reinforced the empire's psychological grip. Subject provinces knew that their goods sustained ceremonies at the heart of the Aztec world. They saw their maize consumed by priests, their garments burned in ritual fire, their captives marched to altars. This reinforced submission. To resist tribute was to resist the gods themselves. The empire cultivated not only political power, but also cosmic authority. Tribute did not merely enrich rulers, it sustained the sun, the rain, the fertility of the earth. Yet the very scale of the system exposed its weaknesses. It required constant flow of goods, of captives, of labor. Interruptions rippled outward, threatening ritual stability. Famine revealed the limits. When harvests failed, ceremonies wavered. Warriors marched farther afield for captives. Provinces resented tribute that stripped them bare. The Triple Alliance, though outwardly united, sometimes strained under disputes about tribute division. Texcoco and Tlacopan resented Tenochtitlan's dominance. Political cracks appeared behind the facade of ritual order. When Hernán Cortés and his small force arrived in 1519, they did not face the Aztec Empire alone. They entered a region of provinces weary of tribute, resentful of sacrifice, eager for change. Tlaxcala, long at war with the Aztecs, allied with the Spaniards. Other provinces followed, seizing the chance to escape burdens that had lasted for generations. The Spanish conquest was not merely a military defeat, it was also the collapse of a ritual economy stretched to its limits. The system had demanded too much from too many. When an alternative appeared, subject peoples seized it. With the conquest, the machinery of tribute and sacrifice was dismantled. Warehouses emptied, calendars disrupted, altars silenced. The Spanish imposed new forms of tribute, labor for encomiendas, crops for colonial authorities. The burdens continued, but the rituals that had justified them vanished. For the descendants of the Aztecs, the memory of the sacrificial system lingered. Chroniclers described its logistics in detail: the tribute lists, the warehouse inventories, the schedules of carriers. These records preserved the scale and precision of the system, even as it faded. Modern historians piece together its workings from codices and Spanish accounts. They see an economy bound to ritual, a society where logistics served theology. The Aztecs believed they were feeding the sun, sustaining the cosmos. The tribute system was their proof of devotion. From one angle, the system was a triumph. A city of hundreds of thousands fed daily, rituals carried out with precision, goods flowing across mountains and jungles. From another angle, it was unsustainable, a system demanding endless goods and captives, prone to famine, rebellion, and exhaustion. Its legacy is both awe-inspiring and sobering. It shows how belief can mobilize vast labor, how ritual can shape an economy, how fear and devotion can sustain empire. Yet it also shows how fragile such systems are when built on relentless extraction. The Aztec ritual economy reveals a truth still relevant. Great systems depend not only on rulers and monuments, but on the unseen labor of countless ordinary people. Their work sustained the empire, even as it strained under the weight of its own demands. When one story closes, another begins. Having explored how the Aztec ritual economy functioned from within, we now turn to how it looked from the outside, to those who arrived across the sea and saw the temples, the rituals, and the sacrifices for the first time. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast with just a few hundred Spaniards. Their weapons were unfamiliar: steel swords, crossbows, cannon, horses. Yet their greatest advantage was not metal, but circumstance. They arrived in a region already strained by tribute, sacrifice, and empire. Indigenous allies became their strength. The Totonacs, chafing under Aztec demands, joined them first. Later, the Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Mexica, added thousands of warriors. Through these alliances, the Spaniards moved inland, toward the Valley of Mexico. Along the way, they saw evidence of the ritual system that bound the empire together. At Cholula, a city sacred to Quetzalcoatl, Spaniards heard rumors of planned ambushes. After bloody fighting, they claimed to see altars stained with blood, temples filled with offerings. Spanish chroniclers described skull racks, the Tzompantli, holding rows of crania pierced through the temples, a public display of sacrifice. To Spanish eyes, these sights confirmed their sense of encountering a land both rich and terrifying. Gold and featherwork dazzled them. Blood and skulls unsettled them. They interpreted the rituals through their own framework of Christian belief, equating sacrifice with devil worship. When Cortés finally entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, the Spaniards were struck by its size and order. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a foot soldier whose memoirs preserve vivid detail, wrote of the causeways, canals, and marketplaces that surpassed anything in Spain. But amid the marvels, one feature disturbed them most. The Great Temple, the Templo Mayor. Twin shrines dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc stood atop a massive pyramid. From its summit, rituals commanded the city's attention. The Spaniards saw idols carved of stone, adorned with jewels and feathers. They saw altars darkened with blood. They smelled the mingling of incense and decay. To them, it was the heart of idolatry, a place demanding destruction. Indigenous allies offered their own interpretations. For Tlaxcalans and Totonacs, the temples of Tenochtitlan represented not just religious centers, but also the machinery of their oppression. They had seen their people march to these altars, had watched their tribute goods vanish into these ceremonies. For them, pointing out sacrificial sites to the Spaniards was not merely descriptive, it was accusatory. They were showing the evidence of what they had endured, the reason for their hatred of Mexico rule. Reactions among Spaniards varied. Some recoiled in horror. They described the sacrificial knives, the piles of offerings, the rituals of heart extraction as barbaric. Others responded with a kind of fascinated detachment, recording details meticulously. Cortés himself wrote to the Spanish king, describing the temples as magnificent in construction but abhorrent in purpose. He stressed both their grandeur and their cruelty, framing his conquest as a mission to end idolatry and liberate subject peoples. Even as Spaniards lodged in the city, the Aztec calendar continued. Priests carried out rituals on schedule, as they had for generations. Sacrifices proceeded, incense burned, drums sounded from the temples. The Spaniards, staying in the palace of Moctezuma, could hear the rhythm of ceremonies through the night. They could not ignore the reality that the empire's life pulsed around these rituals, inseparable from governance, agriculture, and time itself. Misunderstandings ran deep. The Spaniards thought of sacrifice as cruelty. The Aztecs thought of it as necessity. To stop the offerings was to risk cosmic disaster. The Spaniards interpreted idols as false gods. The Aztecs saw them as living embodiments of divine forces. Even Moctezuma's efforts at diplomacy reflected this gulf. He welcomed Cortés with gifts, speaking in metaphors about gods returning from the east. The Spaniards misunderstood, taking his words as submission. Tensions escalated when Spaniards, fearing rebellion, struck preemptively. During the festival of Toxcatl in 1520, when nobles danced in honor of Tezcatlipoca, Spanish soldiers attacked, killing many unarmed celebrants. To the Aztecs, this was sacrilege, an interruption not only of a ceremony, but of cosmic order. Violence spilled into the streets. Cortés returned from campaigns elsewhere to find his men besieged in the palace. The Spaniards eventually fled the city on the Night of Sorrows, leaving behind allies and loot. They had underestimated the depth of devotion that bound the people to their rituals, even amid resentment of tribute. Yet even as conflict raged, the sacrificial cycle resumed. Priests continued offerings, captives were taken, hearts burned. The empire did not pause its obligations, even under invasion. For the Spaniards, this persistence was incomprehensible. How could a people continue such practices in the face of war? For the Aztecs, it was the opposite. How could they stop when the very survival of the sun depended on it? These first encounters were not just military clashes, but collisions of worldview. Spaniards brought steel, horses, and Christianity. Aztecs offered maize, feathers, and blood. In the plazas of Tenochtitlan, in the courtyards of temples, these worlds stared at each other across unbridgeable gaps of meaning. The Spaniards recorded what they saw, with horror. The Aztecs explained what they did with conviction. Neither fully persuaded the other. As the Spaniards prepared for renewed war, and the Aztecs prepared to defend their city with ritual and arms alike, the question hung in the air: whose world would prevail, the one sustained by sacrifice, or the one determined to erase it? By the spring of 1521, the world of the Aztecs was unraveling. Tenochtitlan, the shining city in the lake, faced its gravest trial. The Spaniards had returned, this time with thousands of indigenous allies. Warships floated on the lake, causeways were cut, famine crept through the canals, and yet, amid ruin, sacrifice did not cease. After the Spaniards' retreat in 1520, the Aztecs had rallied. They rebuilt defenses, repaired temples, and resumed ceremonies. New captives, taken from skirmishes, were offered to the gods. These sacrifices were not only ritual obligations, but also declarations of resilience. War councils met in Moctezuma's palace, now ruled by his successors, first Cuitlahuac, then Cuauhtémoc. Priests advised on omens. Diviners consulted the calendar. Warriors painted themselves black or red, adorned with feathers, prepared to fight. The city's strength was not merely in arms, but in its rituals, which reassured the people that the gods still favored them. Cortés returned with reinforcements from Cuba and with thousands of allies, Tlaxcalans, Huexotzincas, and others who had long resented Aztec tribute. His men built brigantines, small warships assembled in Tlaxcala, and carried piece by piece to Lake Texcoco. With these, they planned to control the water routes, cutting off supplies. The siege began in earnest. Spanish ships patrolled the lake. Allied warriors advanced along the causeways. Villages around the lake fell, severing Tenochtitlan's food supply. The once busy markets grew thin. Canoes brought fewer goods. Hunger gnawed at the city. Yet in the face of hunger, ritual intensified. Priests insisted that the gods must be fed if the city were to endure. Sacrifices became both a plea and a display. Captured Spaniards and allies were marched up the steps of the Templo Mayor. Chroniclers describe how their cries echoed across the lake, audible Evi. Enter Spanish camps. Drums pounded, incense rose, and hearts were offered to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Bodies tumbled down the pyramid steps. To Aztec defenders, these sacrifices proclaimed strength, proof that even the invaders could bleed. To the Spaniards, they were horrifying reminders of what awaited if they faltered. Even during the siege, ordinary routines persisted as best they could. Women ground maize into thin gruel, stretching dwindling supplies. Children fetched water from canals, though many canals were fouled with corpses. Men patched canoes, carried weapons, and stood guard on rooftops. Priests maintained the temples, though incense grew scarce. Offerings of flowers replaced cacao or copal when supplies ran low. The calendar's cycle continued. Ceremonies to mark days, prayers to mark months, festivals observed even in abbreviated form. The city lived in dual rhythms, one of famine and battle, another of ritual and obligation. To stop either would have meant surrender. Spanish chroniclers recorded what they saw with a mix of fear and determination. Bernal Diaz wrote of seeing comrades sacrificed, their skins worn by priests in macabre ceremonies. Cortés, in his letters, emphasized the need to destroy the temples, portraying them as centers of darkness. Yet even in their horror, Spaniards acknowledged the discipline of the defenders. They noted how the Aztecs repaired causeways at night, how they used canoes to harry Spanish ships, how their ceremonies continued amid chaos. For Tlaxcalan allies, watching sacrifices of their kin confirmed why they had joined the Spaniards. They saw in the Templo Mayor the same fate their ancestors had suffered. The siege, for them, was not only about conquest, but also about ending the cycle of tribute and sacrifice that had drained them for generations. Their warriors fought fiercely, motivated not only by alliance with Spaniards, but by vengeance against Tenochtitlan. As weeks stretched into months, famine worsened. People ate whatever they could, weeds from canals, bark, insects, even leather stripped from shields. Still, the priests urged sacrifice. Starving captives were dragged to altars, their lives given even as the city's own people weakened. Disease compounded suffering. Smallpox, introduced earlier by Europeans, had already killed many, including Emperor Cuitlawak. Now, other sicknesses spread in cramped, starving quarters. And yet, ceremonies continued. Survivors later recalled how the great drums still sounded, even in the darkest days. To them, the persistence of ritual was itself resistance. Throughout the siege, the Templo Mayor stood as the city's heart. Spaniards targeted it, knowing its destruction would break morale. Defenders fortified it, knowing its survival signified endurance. When Spaniards finally captured sections of the temple, tearing down idols and erecting crosses, the Aztecs rallied to retake them. Battles raged not only for streets and canals, but for sacred space. By summer 1521, Tenochtitlan was a city of fragments. Causeways severed, neighborhoods burned, canals choked with bodies. Yet people still rose each day, grinding what little maize they had, repairing walls, lighting incense. Even as the Spaniards advanced, defenders captured stragglers and offered them to the gods. From Spanish accounts, we know that these sacrifices terrified their enemies. From Aztec perspectives, they affirmed hope. As long as the gods received blood, perhaps the city would survive. But hope strained against reality. Hunger deepened. Allies pressed harder. Spaniards tightened their grip on water routes. Disease claimed more lives. The gods had been fed, but the people were starving. The drums of the Templo Mayor still sounded, but each beat carried a question. Could sacrifice truly sustain the sun, the rain, and the city itself? Or would even the gods turn away as Tenochtitlan crumbled? By midsummer 1521, Tenochtitlan was scarcely a city of abundance any longer. The great markets stood silent. The causeways, once crowded with porters, had become battlefields. The lake, once alive with canoes, was patrolled by Spanish brigantines. The city had become a place of ruins, yet its heart still beat through ritual. Those who survived remembered gnawing hunger as the city's defining feature. The famine was not gradual, but relentless. Stores of maize, beans, and amaranth were long gone. People ate weeds, gnawed bark, and chewed leather softened in water. Some accounts suggest that, in extreme cases, even the bodies of the dead were consumed. Parents could scarcely feed their children. Infants cried without milk. Elderly men and women weakened until they could no longer rise. The canals carried not only water, but the stench of corpses. And yet, through this devastation, the priests continued to perform their duties. Even when incense ran out, they burned whatever could be found: pine needles, scraps of cloth, resin scraped from trees. Offerings had to continue, for to stop was to abandon the gods. Cortés and his allies advanced steadily, block by block, canal by canal. Brigantines cut off supply routes. Tlaxcalan allies poured through breached defenses. Houses were burned. Temples were toppled. The city shrank daily. Spanish accounts describe the defenders' resilience. Even with hunger gnawing at them, Aztec warriors fought from rooftops, hurled spears from canoes, and rebuilt barriers overnight. Women hurled stones from terraces. Boys carried water and weapons. Every household became part of the defense. But the city was closing in on itself. Each day brought new ruins, fewer shelters, narrower spaces. The once expansive capital was reduced to a shrinking core, pressed back toward the Templo Mayor. The Templo Mayor was more than a building. It was the empire's axis. As Spanish forces advanced, the temple became both fortress and altar. Sacrifices continued there, even as famine made captives fewer. Some Spanish chroniclers describe watching comrades dragged up the steps, flayed or offered to the gods. To Spaniards and their allies, this was monstrous. To Aztec defenders, it was sacred necessity, proof that even in ruin, the gods were honored. The drums thundered, deep and resonant, heard across the city and lake. Each beat announced defiance. The Spaniards recorded their own dread, noting how the sound seemed to mock them, to remind them of what might await if they failed. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, fought among his people. Chroniclers describe him encouraging warriors, repairing defenses and presiding over ceremonies. Unlike Moctezuma, who had hesitated before the Spaniards, Cuauhtémoc resisted to the end. His speeches, preserved in later accounts, urged perseverance. The gods would not abandon them. The sun would rise again. Victory was still possible if courage held. For many, his defiance gave strength, even as hunger hollowed them. By August, the Spaniards had captured most of the city. Fires raged through districts, canals filled with debris. Survivors crowded into the center, pressed against the sacred precinct. Disease, hunger, and constant assault thinned them daily. Still, warriors captured when Spaniards strayed too far were sacrificed. Spanish soldiers described hearing drums as their comrades' cries echoed down the pyramid steps. The ritual persisted to the very end, a rhythm of defiance against inevitable defeat. Finally, the Spaniards breached the precinct of the Templo Mayor itself. Battles raged on the steps. Idols were toppled, fires lit, altars smashed. Priests fought with knives and spears, refusing surrender. Chroniclers wrote that blood ran down the steps as warriors and priests fell. Even then, sacrifices were attempted, captives offered in haste before attackers closed in. When the Spaniards seized the temple, they erected crosses, declaring victory over what they called idolatry. But the drums that had pounded through the siege had already left their mark, echoing in memory long after they were silenced. Cuauhtémoc fled by canoe across the lake, seeking escape with a small group of loyalists. But Spanish brigantines intercepted him. He was brought before Cortés, weary, starving, yet defiant. His reported words have been remembered. "I have done all that I could to defend my people. Take the knife in your hand and kill me now." Cortés spared his life, at least temporarily, but the city's fate was sealed. With Cuauhtémoc captured, the city surrendered. The drums fell silent. The temples were torn down. Survivors emerged from ruins, gaunt and broken. The empire that had dominated the Valley of Mexico collapsed into rubble and ash. Yet even in silence, memories lingered, of the sacrifices that continued until the last days, of the belief that feeding the gods might preserve the world a little longer. But what did those final sacrifices mean? Were they acts of devotion, defiance, or despair? Did the gods truly turn away, or did the people see in their fall the failure of their own rituals? These questions remained, carried by survivors into a new world. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 marked not only the end of a city, but the collapse of an entire way of life. The Aztec world, built on cycles of tribute, ritual, and sacrifice, was shattered. Yet the memory of those rituals did not vanish. It lived on in chronicles, in the words of survivors, in the fears and propaganda of Spaniards, and in the whispered stories of descendants. For the Spaniards, sacrifice became a symbol of why conquest had been necessary. Cortés, in his letters, described the idolatry and cruelty he had witnessed, framing Spanish victory as divinely ordained. Missionaries echoed this view, emphasizing sacrifice as proof of a world lost in darkness, in need of Christian salvation. Friars such as Bernardino de Sahagún collected testimonies from Nahua elders, preserving details of festivals, rituals, and sacrifices. Yet even as they recorded, they condemned, filtering memory through Christian judgment. Sacrifice became not only a memory, but a cautionary tale, a reminder of what they believed must never return. For the survivors, memory was more complicated. Many had lived in a world where sacrifice was duty, a necessity for the cosmos. Its loss meant not only the end of empire, but the disruption of sacred cycles. Elders taught younger generations of how festivals once filled the city, how drums thundered, how gods were honored. Some adapted these memories into Christian forms, seeing in saints' festivals echoes of old rituals. Offerings of flowers at church altars resembled those once given at temples. Processions mirrored earlier ceremonies. The outward form changed, but the rhythm of devotion persisted. Others spoke of the fall with sorrow, that the gods had been abandoned, that the sun itself had nearly gone dark. To them, the silence of the drums was not just political defeat, but cosmic rupture. Over time, memory became layered. Spanish accounts emphasized horror. Indigenous accounts often emphasized duty. Later, historians debated, was sacrifice proof of barbarity or evidence of a sophisticated worldview misunderstood by conquerors? Archaeology added another layer. Excavations of the Templo Mayor uncovered altars, knives and offerings, confirming scale but also revealing nuance. Not only humans were sacrificed, animals, figurines, and symbolic items were offered. The practice was diverse, embedded in cycles of agriculture, warfare, and ritual. Sacrifice became one of the defining images of the Aztecs in global memory. European readers, centuries later, shuddered at tales of hearts cut out, bodies tumbling down steps. Writers exaggerated numbers, sometimes claiming tens of thousands of victims at single ceremonies. These accounts shaped an enduring stereotype: the Aztecs as a people of blood and terror. Yet such exaggerations often ignored the broader context, the vibrant culture of poetry, engineering, trade, and governance that also defined their world. Sacrifice, while real and central, became magnified in memory, overshadowing other aspects of life. Yet within families, within oral traditions, memory softened. Sacrifice was not always recalled with fear, but with a sense of continuity, that ancestors had done what was necessary for the world to endure. Ceremonies were remembered not only for death, but for music, flowers, dances, and offerings that honored the gods. Even today, descendants of the Nahua remember fragments of these traditions. In Day of the Dead offerings, in festivals with flowers and incense, echoes remain. While human sacrifice ceased, the sense of honoring the dead, feeding the unseen, and maintaining balance with the cosmos survived in transformed ways. What does it mean to remember sacrifice? To some, it is horror, a reminder of violence. To others, it is duty, a reminder of devotion. To historians, it is a puzzle of scale, meaning, and interpretation. The fall of Tenochtitlan ensured that sacrifice would never again be practiced as it once was. Yet its memory persisted, reshaped by each generation. For Spaniards, it justified conquest. For indigenous peoples, it became part of a layered heritage, sometimes silenced, sometimes reinterpreted. For the modern world, it remains a subject of fascination, unsettling, yet deeply human in its search for meaning and survival. As you think back on these stories, the captured warriors, the stone knives, the drums echoing across the lake, you are not only recalling moments of blood, but of belief. Sacrifice was never random. It was ritual, obligation, hope, and fear bound together. It was the heart of an empire, beating until its very last days. The Templo Mayor is gone, reduced to ruins beneath the streets of modern Mexico City. But when archaeologists uncover an altar, or when a festival fills the plaza with flowers and music, echoes return. The memory of sacrifice endures, not as spectacle, but as a reminder of how deeply humans have sought to sustain their world. So in the end, why did it suck to be an Aztec sacrifice victim? Because you became part of a system that demanded everything from you, body and soul, to keep the cosmos turning. Yet even in your death, you became part of something that outlived empires, languages, and centuries. the memory of a people who believed the universe itself depended on their devotion,